Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're talking about episode 6, Silenced, in the Netflix series Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer Story, written by Ryan Murphy. The show chronicles the murders of Jeffrey Dahmer through different perspectives, in an attempt to show how Dahmer's murders were enabled by a police force and a system that by default is set to discount anyone who isn't white as non-human and unworthy of justice. What makes the show brilliant is it's not so much, oh my god, what is he gonna do next? It's like, oh my god, how is he able to do that next, right? You're more shocked by his ability to move freely in the world than what he's doing. And this was a very difficult feat to accomplish. If white privilege were a person, it would be Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer is one of a few serial killers that continues to hold our public fascination. And every year we have to revisit a serial killer. For a while it was Ted Bundy, and this year it's Jeffrey Dahmer. With serial killers, it's usually the act that makes them famous, right? First, we mistakenly ask, okay, oh my god, what did he do? And then secondly, we mistakenly ask, okay, like, what made him this way? And if the victim is Googled, it's usually to see like what was done to the victim. It's not so much who the victim was and, you know, what kind of person this was. And you see this with the reactions on Twitter, right? Like some people, like some of the comments were like, oh my god, I didn't know he did this or that apartment. I saw comments like, will you guys do a series on this serial killer or that serial killer? Like, you ain't seen nothing yet. Like, you thought Dahmer was bad. And I was like, we've seen enough, actually. Like, no need, okay? And I think the point of that is to, again, that like kind of sick public fascination we have with like the horrible things people could do. Focusing on a killer's actions is problematic for a lot of reasons. First, especially if the crime is particularly disturbing, what it does is that it kind of makes their crime seem inevitable. Like no one could have stopped this. It's so evil that there's nothing we could do, right? And as the series unpacks, his crimes were entirely preventable from day one. Besides Dahmer, the series shifts its sort of attention onto the officers and the judicial system who time and time again let Dahmer get away with murder. Like, this man should have just been covered in blood after some point. The almost like absurdity of Dahmer's reign is made clear a few times, but the scene that stands out at me the most is towards the end when he's caught. The police have the audacity to evacuate the building because they detected toxic chemicals, which they say is dangerous to public health, making it very clear that Dahmer was a monster hiding in plain sight. The amount of complaints that Dahmer received in terms of like the smell, the chemicals coming from his apartment, you know, the smell was so potent, but because of the people reporting it, Dahmer, you know, like they were ignored. So episode 6 of Silenced is one of the best episodes of TV I've seen in a very long time. It comes as a surprise episode, like I was taken aback by it. And it's the hardest to watch because at this point, the series has done a very good job of establishing all the reasons why Tony should never have come in proximity to this man. The episode is also incredibly engaging, right? And the reason we keep focusing on the killer's acts is because I think Hollywood just thinks that we won't be interested in anything else, right? Like there's Dahmer, there's Dahmer's friends, there's In the Mind of a Killer. Like we're so focused on the person that it kind of, you know, they become this fictitious character, like this boogeyman, this Candyman. And this episode was the best episode yet, and it focused on the victim, right? The episode was compelling, his life was compelling, we were engaged, we were rooting for him, and again, it's to kind of shift that narrative. What this episode does so well is that it rehumanizes Dahmer's victims, and everything in this series is very well tied together. I mean, it is a tight script. And the lead up to episode 6 was also brilliant, right? Because it's the last episode before we focus on the aftermath. Episode 2, we see a body lying face down in Dahmer's apartment when he's killing Conrad Sinta-Samphone, a young boy escorted back to Dahmer after he managed to get away. The body lying face down is a prop, almost like we don't even notice it because of all the chaos happening in the background. When Konarak is returned to Dahmer, the police enter his flat, unable to detect anything wrong despite being like literally meters, centimeters away from a dead body. Besides the dead body, his apartment is reeking with toxic chemicals, right? Which is why they evacuated the place. And the point of this, and they make it very clear throughout the series, is that police had very little regard for Dahmer's victims, because we forget that being a victim is actually a privilege. Like, to be seen as someone worthy of justice, to be seen and acknowledged, and have someone punished for the things that they've done to you is not a given, right? You have to fight for that right. The fact that these bodies were hiding in plain sight, right? Like, this guy was decomposing torsos in his living room. And, you know, they ignored these red flags time and time again. Like, and again, it's to really emphasize that his victims were not people worthy of being taken care of by the system. So there was this attitude of like, it's none of my business. Like, this is not our, like, it is what it is. Like, let's just go focus on something else. This whole point, again, like, the more Jeffrey, like, gets away with it, it's clear that the system just doesn't care, because the episode prior to this is a perfect lead up, right? Because all the checks and balances that should have had Dahmer in jail, like, totally failed, to the point where he's convicted of, you know, assaulting a child, and the judge says, listen, you remind me of my grandson. And he uses his discretion to make sure that when Jeffrey gets out of jail, that this will not, you know, ruin his life, that he'll be able to get back on his feet again, right? It's just an alcoholism problem. Like, you know, whatever it is, like, you can overcome it. By leaving out the exact nature of Dahmer's crimes, and by not really disclosing the exact nature of Dahmer's crimes to the people who continuously complained about him, pretty much tells you, like, they didn't see his victims as meeting the threshold required to be a human being. So episode 5 ends with Dahmer escorting Tony back to his apartment, and the lead up to this last scene is the focus of episode 6. What made episode 6 just heartbreaking, especially when you watch the series like up until this point, is that you realize, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but the body that we see in episode 2, that, you know, while Dahmer is killing Konarak, is Tony Anthony Hughes. I believe that was the body lying face down. You know, this model, friend, son, uncle, brother, much more, reduced by Dahmer as a prop, right? Like, reduced to just a body lying on the ground, just the victim. And I do like how the show, you know, although Dahmer didn't see his victims as people, apparently neither did the police. And so the series takes care not to show us any of the murders, but you feel it all at the same time. Like, I never actually took note of the fact that we didn't see any of it. Like, it felt like I saw it even though I didn't see it. And adding all these different perspectives to the show is really infuriating, because you're no longer thinking about the things that Jeffrey Dahmer has done, right? Like, it's more like you're kind of in shock that he was able to do it for so long. So now, moving into the episode. So the focus of this video will be to look at episode 6, Silenced. You can look at the description box down below to skip ahead. It begins with a mother giving birth to a child. The child, we later find out, is Tony Anthony Hughes. And one of the more impressive sort of aspects of the show is the ability of its ability to kind of move from one perspective to another, like, almost seamlessly. Like, it's so natural and it's so well done. And you see that just before Anthony's mother has an appointment with a doctor, and she finds out that her son has suffered permanent hearing loss, a side effect of antibiotics prescribed to him by a previous doctor. But, you know, you kind of switch in and out of perspectives, right? So at some point, we don't know that that baby is Tony yet, but you're kind of seeing through his eyes and he can't hear anything. And then it just transitions, right? Like, the transition from Tony as a baby to Tony as an adult was just like perfection. And it was smooth. I mean, everything about the show was very smooth. So we're introduced to Tony smiling, tapping his chest at the club with his friends, having a great time, and just kind of dancing to the beat of his own drum. From the first episode, you know, the first few moments of this episode, it's emphasized that Tony is someone with a good heart, right? He's someone who clearly sees the good in people. And I really enjoyed the club scenes, because, as I said, like, the problem with a lot of serial killer shows, and with Dahmer in particular, like the more grotesque the act, everybody gets demonized, right? Including the victims. And one of the ways the show seeks to kind of rehumanize the victims is through these club scenes, right? Because, you know, these are not these dirty, dark places, right? These club scenes are just people there, they're having fun, they're disarmed. You know, they're just there to have a good time, right? And so as you're watching it, you're like, I can totally relate to this. And again, they're dancing away in a space that they thought was safe. And so Tony, you know, he has no trouble attracting potential love, but we see in the first scene that they kind of lose interest once they find out that he's deaf. And during a dinner scene entirely shot in sign, like this scene was so impressive to me. Like, you guys let me know what you think. They're discussing their dreams, their frustrations, their goals. Like, it's so relatable, right? It's just a bunch of friends kicking it after they've gone out. You know, we've all been there. And I think one of the reasons this episode worked so well is mostly because of the actor cast as Tony Hughes, who is Rodney Burford, I believe. He was perfect. Not only was his acting, you know, phenomenal, but he was able to kind of keep pace with Evan Peters, who, you know, he's a whole other video by himself, but Evan Peters was so overwhelming as Jeffrey Dahmer to the point where he was Jeffrey Dahmer. So the actors starring like alongside him had to be equally strong, and I felt that with this actor, like from a creative standpoint, it was phenomenal. And I will say that all the actors cast as Dahmer's victims were memorable. You know, they were not background characters. You remember each and every one of them, and I think that speaks to the care that was taken in the show in terms of acting, in terms of just storytelling. Like, it's a very tight script, in my opinion. This actor, he brought a degree of relatability. Like, as soon as you see Tony, you know, tapping his chest, you're like, I like this guy. Like, everything about him, you feel like it's someone you know or could be friends with. And the effects of that, you know, it makes you angry. So after he's done going out with his friends, we are then introduced to Tony's family. And within Tony's family, there's like this atmosphere of love and comfort here. And here we see Tony, you know, he's a brother and a son. And despite not living his dreams, like, he's kind of in limbo, like he's hanging out with his friend. Like, he's just a normal, regular guy trying to figure life out. You know, his family's still supportive, you know, they're just like, you know, you'll figure it out. It's all good. Don't worry about it. Then things take a dark turn when during dinner there's a knock at the door, and Tony answers it to find his friend waiting on the other side. He's informed that their close friend Rico, who we saw in that diner scene, was killed and dumped near a highway. And this has a profound effect on Tony, right? Like, he is just totally devastated. He doesn't know what to do with himself. And this triggers Tony to pack his bags and leave, right? He's kind of done. He's like, listen, time waits for no one, and I'm getting the hell out of here. And his friend's death alerted him to kind of the cruel reality, which is like, tomorrow is never promised, right? So you have to live today. And so he has to leave home, right? The only way he's going to grow is if he, you know, gets out of his comfort zone. And there's a scene with his mother because she's quite concerned, and she says, listen, Tony, like, the world is a dangerous place. You have to be around family to keep you safe. And it's an especially dangerous place if you're, you know, black, gay, deaf. Like, his mother was like, listen, you do not want to be out here in this world like this. And he's just like, listen, I got to do what I have to do. Like, there's nothing else I don't know what to tell you. So undeterred, Tony leaves home, determined to make his way in the world. And it's not easy, right? It's really not easy. And he kept trying to get jobs at these, like, music stores. And if only they knew how much rhythm he had. But again, like, during this time especially, and the stigma still exists, if you have a disability, especially like a physical disability, like if you're deaf, people were looking at him like he was, that somehow speaks to his mental state, right? Like, oh, there's something wrong with you, right? And so you could tell by how people were looking at him going into these stores that they were looking at him like he was the serial killer, right? Like, oh, you're deaf? Get out of here. Luckily for Tony, he persisted, he kept going, and eventually he found the right place with the right people, and he's happy. You know, there's a cute scene where he's kind of like tapping his toes. And again, throughout the episode, I was impressed by how quickly we became attached to Tony and how you're just kind of rooting for him. Even though you know how the episode's going to end, you still hope for the best. You're like, please, let one person go. So everything seems to be going fine for Tony until he's, you know, on campus one day and he sees an advertisement for models. And at first I got really scared because we all know that one of Jeffrey's tactics was to lure his victims by offering them money in exchange for photos. So I just thought that maybe that was a posting from Jeffrey. And I got really concerned, but thankfully it was like a legitimate photo shoot. And I was happy, you know, like he was living his dream. He was getting his pictures taken. And this scene was fantastic, and a few things stood out at me. First, again, the subtle shifts in perspective, right? So they kind of finished the photo shoot, and then the photographer offers him a Coke, and we can't actually hear the Coke bottle open because we're going through Tony's eyes. And Tony, you know, he's adorable. He communicates through pen and paper. And as much as he wants to find somebody, he's someone with like an enormous amount of self-respect and love for himself. And, you know, at one point he's like, does love live here? Like, I know you like me and you know I like you, but like, is this gonna go anywhere? And again, this is to humanize Tony as someone like you or me. And he was not someone living on the edge, right? Like there's nothing that any of Dahmer's victims did to warrant ever having the misfortune of coming across the Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Like sometimes, again, with a serial killer, his victims are also demonized, and there's that proximity that we create, like that could never be me. As you're watching Tony, you're like, you know what, that could be me, right? That's kind of the point of the episode, to make you realize, listen, this could have been you, this could have been a friend of yours, this could have been anyone, so you need to rethink that. During this time, he's finding his footing, he gets a job, everything is fine, and he's asked to come home. You know, he comes home and he's wondering, okay, why did you ask me to come home again? And he's informed that his sister is giving birth to a baby girl, and she's gonna name the girl Tony after him. And so now he's a son, a brother, and an uncle, and so everything is fine. And during his stay with his family, he decides to go out and meet his friends and have a good time. And this is when he meets Jeffrey Dahmer. And I got this sinking, I can't even describe to you the sinking feeling I got when I saw Dahmer sitting at the bar, you know, and they were locking eyes, and his friend was like, this guy, like, you need to go over there. I'm like, you don't need to go over there. And unfortunately for all of us, Jeffrey was not deterred by Tony's disability. He did not care that he was deaf or not deaf. And I was like, no. At one point they're dancing, and Jeffrey asks, listen, how did you learn to dance so well? Like, what? Like, I'm kind of confused here. And Tony places Jeffrey's sort of hand on his heart, and Jeffrey could hear like his heart beating, you know? And again, Jeffrey's soulless, you know, there's nothing in him. And you notice that in these club scenes, right? He's moving around erratically, like the man has nothing inside him. So when he hears Tony's heartbeat, he's hooked, right? He's like, I have to make this mine. And they're dancing the night away, Dahmer doing his usual song and dance. And again, by this time, we've become too accustomed to Dahmer's ways. He's drinking himself into oblivion, getting ready to spike another drink. But for some reason, he resists the urge to spike Tony's drink. And instead, he agrees to see him more frequently. And this whole sequence of events between Tony and Dahmer, it's there for a reason, right? Like the degree of affection that Tony gives, he puts his hands around him. He wants to be seen with him. He really involves him in his life. And there are moments when you see this with Dahmer's other victims where, you know, he's being given a lot of affection, right? But so the issue isn't love and affection. It's just about control. It's about finding someone that he could, you know, reduce to a mannequin, essentially. You know, it was the superficiality of it all. Like Dahmer doesn't mind going around with Tony, shopping, paying for dinner, as long as he maintains the sense of control and they make him feel like how he needs to feel, right? They're doing what he wants to do. They're willing to watch whatever movie that he wants to watch, right? Like he has to be the one. You have to enjoy it. You have to sit there, play whatever games that he wants to play. Then yeah, he'll keep you alive for as long as possible. In another standout scene, Dahmer and Tony are having lunch, and Dahmer asks Tony, is it exhausting to work so hard to be understood? To which Tony responds, if he didn't make the effort, he would have no one. Concerned, Dahmer asks a follow-up question, asks basically, saying to Tony, like, is it tiring to write everything down? And again, Tony reassures him. He's like, you know what? Doing it with you seems okay because you seem worth it. And I was like, no. And you can see Dahmer smiling. And again, he's getting that high. He's getting that fix. And for that reason, he's keeping Tony around, right? Like, he's a prop at that point. So Tony not only shows Dahmer affection, but he reassures him, right? But little does Tony know that he's dealing with a pure monster. And his decision to keep Tony alive is a selfish one. He was never going to change. And it's this whole thing about Dahmer, and like the series plays with it. Like, he goes through these periods of stability and then he does something crazy again. And his father, played by Richard Jenkins, by the way, and I'll talk about that scene when he comes over to Dahmer's apartment. But Richard Jenkins, again, he went toe-to-toe with Evan Peters. Like, he was a standout for me. Like, I couldn't believe my eyes. And again, the casting in this show is so spot on, right? And that's why you're able to focus on everything outside of Dahmer, is because it's so tightly written. This whole scene of Dahmer's father coming over and looking around, like, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The thing with Dahmer is, like, everything and everybody in his life is just a prop. And the minute they no longer serve whatever function he needs it to serve, he pretty much, like, does away with it. And so the time in which he's hanging out with Tony, at some point he clocks that he's been taking Tony's cues and Tony hasn't been taking his cues, right? Like, he's kind of getting that sense that he doesn't have as much control over the situation as he thought he did. And once he realizes this, he starts to panic, and that's when he kind of makes the decision to kill him. The unraveling, this realization happens when finally, or unfortunately, Dahmer invites Tony back to his apartment. And they play this game called Infinity Land. And so this is the moment where we realize, like, who the young man was at the end of the last episode. And you're like, oh, this is Tony. So we've come full circle, and now we're back we're back to where we began. So Tony comes over, his back is turned to Dahmer. He feels comfortable, he feels safe, he doesn't think anything is going to happen. And still, Dahmer cannot find it in him to spike his drink, right? Like, he's thinking about it, but he doesn't do it. And he doesn't do it because for the time being, there's no need to. Awkwardly, they sit there side by side until Dahmer suggests, like, okay, well, if we're going to pass the time, let's play a game I invented when I was a child called Infinity Land. And this game is pretty much a metaphor for, Dahmer's murders, right? Like, his rules are the only rules. So there are two pieces in which he calls soldiers, and they start at the end of the board. To move along the spiral, you have to move the dice. The twist is, if Tony's soldier gets anywhere close to Dahmer's, his piece disappears into the vortex. And when Tony asks, like, okay, why did you structure the game this way? Like what was the point of this? He reiterates this question quite a bit, and Dahmer is frustrated, right? He's unable to answer the question. He's just like, that's just the rules of the game. He's offended that he even has to justify himself. He's like, why are you even asking me that question? Right? Like, how dare you? And as they start playing the game, the way the game is set up, it's whoever Dahmer is playing, like, their piece will inevitably get close to Dahmer's. And before Dahmer can kind of banish Tony's soldier into the vortex, which seems to be his favorite part, right? Like, he likes that control of being able to wipe people off, the face of the planet, like some type of god. Tony stops him, he kind of grabs his hand and he's like, whoa, chill. And he kind of tells Dahmer, like, listen, you don't gotta play this way, right? Like, we can come up with our own rules. We can work together. But what Tony doesn't realize is that there's no we here. There's only I, and that I was Dahmer. You either play by his rules or you don't play at all. It's really that simple. And so when they're finally done playing, Dahmer goes in for a kiss, but Tony kind of curves him, right? And he says, you can kiss me on the cheek. And I think it's here that Dahmer realized, like, oh, I actually have no control over the situation. Like, I'm playing by somebody else's rules and I don't really like it. Not only does he realize that he's been playing by somebody else's rules, he realizes that he's been playing by somebody else's rules for a lot longer than he's comfortable admitting. And so miraculously, Tony is not murdered that night. And, you know, the morning of, you know, when Dahmer does make the decision to kill him, they kind of wake up and you see Dahmer wrapped around Tony like a mannequin, right? He's just like, and this whole, it's reiterated so many times in the series. Like, again, he doesn't see his victims as people. So Tony wakes up and he's like, I gotta go to work. I gotta like, and Dahmer is in a panic, right? He's like, don't leave, don't go. And he has no control over the situation. He can't negotiate. Like, he has to go to work and he's overwhelmed, right? He says like, hey, how do I know you're coming back? When are you coming back? When will I see you again? Like, all this uncertainty, it just kind of like overwhelms him. And again, it's control issues, right? And the only way he can kind of take back control is to totally remove the autonomy of every single person he comes in contact with, right? He didn't like the sense of uncertainty. He didn't like the not knowing. So he ended it altogether. And that scene when he pulls out the hammer and you can see like the Polaroids in the drawer, I mean, he was really a monster hiding in plain sight. Like, this man, and he takes it and he's holding it and he's really considering like what to do. And momentarily you're kind of relieved because Tony leaves the apartment faster than Dahmer can kind of make a decision, right? Like, Tony got his shoes on, he's like, I gotta go. And that scene when he's like, I gotta go, I was like, and again, the actor who plays Tony it was not easy to act alongside Evan Peters. Like, you can say whatever you want, but Evan Peters was Jeffrey Dahmer. And it was not easy to stand side by side. And he gave him such a, like, the contrast between the two. So he leaves the apartment and you're like, whew, like, thank God. And then the episode cuts away, right? It cuts away to his mother reporting Tony missing to the police. And from there, we know immediately that he's gone, right? Like, Tony is dead. This scene of Tony's mother, like, reporting him to the police was quite sad, right? Because she's trying to humanize her son to the police, right? She's saying, like, he's deaf. Like, she's trying to give him a fighting chance because she knows, you know, first, her son is black, so they already don't care. If they find out that he's gay, like, they're really not gonna care. So let me just try. And that's the thing, like, you have to prove that you're someone worthy of being taken care of and looked after. And that was the situation that a lot of Dahmer's sort of, the victims and the victims' families, like, they were kind of in that position because they just couldn't get anyone interested, right? Before we circle back to Dahmer killing Tony, like, the way it kind of takes us back, again, it's very well done and there's a reason for that. We see that Dahmer is flying into a rage. By now we know that he's killed him, but we don't know how or what led up to it or what triggered it. We know what triggered it, but we didn't see it. And again, Dahmer's flying into a rage because he wants control. And meanwhile, his neighbor Glenda is hearing it all. And the episode after this is brilliant. Like, I was debating whether or not to do this episode or that episode. But Glenda is hearing the whole thing, right? She's reported this man as much as she can. And there's really nothing else she can do, right? Like, she's paralyzed. And so Dahmer, being Dahmer, drinks himself into oblivion because he needs control again. He liked the sense of knowing something that other people don't know, right? Like, he had this severe, like, inferiority complex. And so to take back his sense of control, he attends this event that Tony's mother held in hopes that she could kind of gather support so they could find her son, because the only person who's going to find Tony are his family, right? The police don't care. They kind of made it clear. So he shows up to the event. He has the audacity to donate. And as soon as he sees Tony's friend, you know, like someone that could identify him, he runs, right? And I think the fact that he felt like he had to run, again, he was losing control, right? He was reacting to something. He didn't like that he could possibly be seen. So he goes back to his apartment. He's frustrated. He takes out all the IDs of the men that he's killed, and he picks up one, right? And calls the sister, or he calls the family of Errol Lindsay, and his sister picks up. And this was one of the most, that's the thing, the series doesn't show you anything, but you feel it. Like, there's a sense of dread after every episode that's really hard to describe. And so his sister picks up the phone and she's like, who is this? And he's like, you know what, stop looking for your brother because he's gone. You know, you're not going to find him because he's gone. He's in the vortex. The whole thing of, you know, he was gone into the vortex and he just hangs up. And again, this vortex is a metaphor for anything, you know, what happens to people who come close to Dahmer, right? Who challenge his authority, who don't agree to play by his rules, right? You're going into the vortex, you're done. No one will ever know what happens to you, no one will look for you, and that's the end of it. So following this scene of him, you know, calling a victim's family, we finally find out what happens to Tony. And Tony, you know, he forgot his keys. That's how the episode portrays it. He forgot. And in that moment, you know, Dahmer has a second chance to get control back. And this is one of the few victims where he doesn't drug, right? He just like violently kills him. Like he just kind of goes in on him. And they don't show us the murder, but you know exactly what happens and you feel devastated nonetheless. But one of the points the show makes really well is that there's nothing to unpack with Dahmer. Like, it's a compulsion. Like, this man was evil. You know, this kind of sick fascination with the things that he's done or, like, what made him do it. There's like, y'all are glorifying him, right? Like, this is a compulsion. This is someone who's evil. And he wanted a sense of control. And the minute he didn't have it, that was it, right? And what made Dahmer's crimes like particularly triggering is that you don't know, right? You don't know what happens to it. Like the families don't know what happened to their loved ones. They don't know if they're dead. They don't know if they're alive. And so Dahmer becomes kind of like this boogeyman, this candy man hiding in the background. And the reason he's able to have this anonymity and this power over people is because like the police did nothing. Right? Like there were so many clues. Like this was not someone who, you know, was an outstanding citizen. Like he had a criminal record. He had a trail of blood behind him. And yet time and time again, he kept getting away with the same thing. And it's quite eerie because Dahmer kept the body parts in his apartment. Right? Kind of ending any sense of closure that the families could have, right? Like the odds of you even finding their bodies was like slim to none. And tension, this unknowing, this kind of boogeyman status, this fear, this kind of like mental hold that Dahmer was able to have over people is really nicely illustrated through Tony's mother, because you know they don't know what happened to their son. And there's a scene when they're eating dinner, and obviously the vibe is gone, right? Like they're sad, they don't know what happened to their brother, their uncle, their son, they don't know. And his mother is sitting there and she's looking at the chair where he normally sits and she's recalling their last conversation. And this flashback is quite eerie because this is the last conversation he has. It's suggested before he goes out to meet his friend, this friend being Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Like he's wearing the same clothes he was wearing when he went out to meet Dahmer. In this conversation, they discuss everything, right? Like Tony's work, how he's getting along. His mother is quite worried about him. She's like, so is everything okay? Are you making friends? Like, you know, what's going on with you? And, you know, he's like, it's fine. Everything is fine. And his mother brings up the AIDS pandemic, right? Like this is kind of the peak time. And there's a reason why they're having this conversation, and the show is showing us this, right? Because at some point his mother was saying like, listen, you know, the AIDS is a problem. Like, are you watching yourself? Are you being safe? Are you doing this? And Tony's like, yeah, I am being safe. And you know, at one point she kind of mentions that she had to speak up to the pastor because at this time, like AIDS was seen as like God's punishment for being gay. Like that was kind of the messaging. And so this just added even more tension because again, there's like the police just didn't care, right? Like this was the tension, this was the environment, this was the circumstances during this time. So the only people who were gonna look after Tony were his mother and his family. And, you know, if the church doesn't care about you, like what makes you think the police care about you, right? Like they might as well be one and the same at that point. I really enjoyed this conversation because, again, because by now you've kind of grown attached to Tony and, you know, like it's hard, that proximity between you and the victim, like the show just kind of bridges that gap. And again, like this conversation was brilliant for a lot of reasons because it's to emphasize like, listen, the system as a whole, like these crimes were preventable, and the reason that not as much work was basically why the police just didn't do their jobs is because they just didn't see these people as people, right? And therefore there was just no effort made. Even if some effort had been made, none of this would have happened, right? And in one of the saddest scenes, right, like before he leaves to go meet Dahmer, I'm assuming, his mother says, listen, do not leave town before saying goodbye to me. And he's like, of course I would never do that. And, he wishes her one last goodbye. With that, she never sees her son again. So now we get to the end of the episode, and this ending was impactful for a lot of reasons. So the episode ends with Jeffrey removing a piece of human flesh, which is kind of shaped like a heart in a way. And I'm assuming that's Tony's heart. And this is such a stark contrast to the start of the episode when we're introduced to Tony as a young man dancing to the beat of his own drum. And the point in showing us him kind of consuming that human flesh is pretty much a metaphor for like how the police and the system totally failed, right? Like they didn't see Tony or his victims as human, right? Like they saw them as a piece of meat. Like they didn't see these victims any more or less human than Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Like they kind of saw these people in the same light. And when he's sitting there and he's kind of consuming him, and the episode just ends. And the transition from episode to episode is brilliant. This was a fantastic episode, right? Like when you look at the start of the episode to how it ended, when you look at the differing perspectives, and again, this was the only episode that explicitly focused on like the victim's perspective, and it was the best episode. Again, debunking the idea that only the serial killer, like people aren't gonna watch or be interested in anything like that. And more so than that, like how tight the script is, right? Like Dahmer was a monster, but so are the people that allowed him to get away with it for so long, right? He saw his victims as a prop and, to be used and discarded as he felt. But is that really any different from the people that continuously let him go time and time again, that tried to rehabilitate him, that pretty much, like, I don't know what else Dahmer could have done, and I think the show does a good job of kind of reorienting your mind. Like, you're not disgusted or frightened by the act itself. You're disgusted and frightened by the fact that he's able to get away with it for so long, right? You're not sitting there watching the series like, what's he gonna do next? Like, instead you're just like, how is he able to do this again? And that's why it works. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.